Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 3, Episode 14, The Percentage, starring Alex Nicol as Eddie and Nita Talbot as Louise. And unfortunately, I have to say this was my least favorite episode of the season so far. I didn't think it was very good at all. This whole episode relies on one plot contrivance after another, in my opinion. And the ending, in my opinion, was really silly and totally came out of nowhere. Nothing about this episode really worked for me at all, other than Nita Talbot's performance. She at least tried to inject some energy into this episode. So we start with a man, Eddie, and his wife Faye, and they're talking. And we learn that Eddie gets a little tense, and he also gets dizzy spells from time to time, which is somewhat important to the plot. We also learn that he has to get his TV repaired because he broke it somehow, and he calls this man named Pete, who we find out he knows. They served together in the war. And at this point, you can tell there's a lot of tension when Faye comes back out into the room. For some reason, Eddie doesn't like that. We also learn that Eddie's very guilty. Supposedly, Pete is keeping some kind of secret for Eddie about he was a coward or something in the war. They don't go into it in great detail, like a lot of things in this episode. But it basically turns out Pete's been covering for him all these years, some kind of secret. So at this point, Eddie offers Pete money, but Pete says he's doing fine and he doesn't want to accept it. This really upsets Eddie. So he decides instead, Pete says, you can at least take me and my wife out to dinner. So in the next scene, they go out to this dinner, and we are introduced to Louise, Pete's wife, our other main character. And Eddie and Louise start dancing. What Eddie is really interested in is having Louise talk Pete into accepting Eddie's offer. He says, I can give him his own business and you'll make a lot more money. Louise is interested in this and says she'll try to help, but we also find out she's very interested in Eddie. Of course. So at this point, we go to the next scene, and there's some tension between Eddie and his wife, Faye, over this. So at this point, Eddie goes to visit Louise, and she says, I tried, but Pete just won't accept your offer. And Eddie gets mad about this, but Louise calms him down. Her and Eddie kiss at this point, and Louise somewhat comes on to him here in kind of a subtle way. And you can tell that Louise really likes Eddie at this point. Eddie's only interested in giving Pete this money for some reason. So at this point, Pete comes home and he has a fight. It's basically about the same thing again. This was already starting to get repetitive at this point of the episode. So they fight over this money issue. Eddie basically breaks something, and when he offers to pay for it, Pete kicks him out. So Eddie has to leave. Pete is upset, but you can tell that Louise isn't too upset about the money that Eddie left behind. So at this point, we get this scene where Eddie and this guy, he talks to this guy that's his boss. The man basically tells him to stop seeing Pete and Louise because it's bad for their business. This scene to me was totally unnecessary. Why even have this character in the episode? Just another plot contrivance, basically. I really wasn't wild about this at all. I guess it gives us a little more insight into Eddie's character, but I didn't really think it was necessary personally. So at this point, Louise calls Eddie. She says she has a plan to make Pete accept the money, which winds up not being true. But Eddie goes to visit her anyway. They're kissing again. Louise is coming on to him again. This is basically a repeat of the last scene between them. Only this time Eddie flips out when he finds out Louise's true motives, and he basically kills her. So at this point, everyone in the neighborhood can hear this. Pete walks in. It turns out the police were called and got to the scene awfully quickly, of course, because everything in this episode just happens the way it needs to happen. So the police come in, basically, and Pete doesn't cover for Eddie. So Eddie is basically accused of killing Louise. And then the episode throws all credibility out the window when Pete goes to visit Faye, who we haven't seen for quite a while, and basically tells her the story of what happens. And they kiss, and I guess Pete and Faye were a couple the whole time. This is kind of done humorously, which makes no sense at all. I'm not sure if this was a plan by the two of them the whole time, or if they just got together now. This ending totally didn't work for me, and neither does this episode. This is easily one of the weaker Alfred Hitchcock Presents episodes of the first 3 seasons, in my opinion. The character motivations just don't make a lot of sense. And either Other than Nita Talbot, who I think gives it her all in this episode, the rest of the acting is kind of average for this show, too, in my opinion. The characters are just kind of there. So overall, I'm going to give the percentage a 1.5 out of 5. This is definitely not an episode of the show you need to watch unless you're watching every episode. So 1.5 out of 5 for the percentage. And as always, thank you very much for watching.